Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for class for Wednesday, the 24th, where we are talking about Dead Poets Society and we are also talking about poetry. As you know, we're a little bit behind schedule, but I'm going to move us a little bit faster so that we can catch up. And in terms of Dead Poets Society, it was a book that was adapted from a film screenplay shortly prior to the film's release. And it's set in the late 1950s, 1959, 1960, a New England prep school. We definitely get the sense of the kind of privilege and power and financial advantages that these students have. These are the elite of the elite. These schools cost as much as private universities and are preparing students for the Ivy Leagues of Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And we definitely see a world of the 1950s and 1960s. And there's ways to critique this film. Obviously, the idea of the objectification of female. Female is treated as possession and as an object. The cultural appropriation and the colonialism. Notice that they go to an Indian cave, and then we've got one of the characters who gives himself a ethnic name as a way of illustrating rebellion. Definitely there is this element of classism and great economic privilege, but it also is an incredibly inspiring story about the power of poetry. And since we are entering into our poetry unit, I thought it would be quite appropriate for us to have this film introduce poetry. And as you know, one of the major themes of the film is the balance between conformity and individuality. And really, as we've seen all semester long, and I've said that this is pretty much the case with all literature, that one of the major lessons is about balance. You want to avoid the extremes. And obviously, you want to avoid the extremes of conformity, which is what the school is trying to teach. But the extremes of individuality come with some rather negative consequences, as we see. Mr. Keating, the name of the teacher in the play, is a play on John Keats. John Keats was a very famous romantic poet from the 1800s. And of course, the Dead Poets Society is about the power of the Romantics. The film has oftentimes been viewed from a queer lens as well. The idea that our main character, who is so torn with being able to admit to his father his true passions, that this is just a subtext for what this character is not able to admit to the world and his father, and that he is an outsider in terms of his sexual orientation. I think that reading might go a little bit too far myself, but I did want you to know that that was one of the ways in which this particular text has been. And of course, we're viewing these films as if they were texts. It's one of the ways that this film has been interpreted. But I think the more common interpretation is about the power of language and the importance of finding one's voice and the importance of being able to question authority, but to be able to do it in a responsible manner. So the film, ultimately has this wonderful scene where we've got the scholar Pritchard talking about the ways to evaluate poetry. And our teacher, Mr. Keating, says, "Rip that out. That's not valid." And of course, it gets to the question of what is poetry and how do we evaluate it. And if you have had a chance to do the readings that I've assigned, thus far for our poetry section. And these readings, for the most part, unfortunately, I was not able to find free links for online because they're introductory, but you can find them in the text. And of course, we have a version of the text on reserve at GCC. The good news is that once we get to the actual poetry proper itself, I'll be able to provide you with links for the poetry. There really is no clear definition for poetry. I've heard it said that you know it when you see it, which is a definition that's also been used for pornography. Yes, it's true that poetry often utilizes rhyme, the ending of words with similar sounds, and meter, so that it has a particular kind of beat. Notice how often music was used in Dead Poets Society to illustrate the idea of the musicality of poetry. And alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds. But ultimately, poetry doesn't have to follow any kind of rules. It is usually rather short, but you can have epic poems that could be as long as a novel. It's very dense and it's very compact. Hence, it's going to require multiple readings. And I know I've been saying this all semester long about the importance of multiple readings, but I also know it may not be practical to read Midsummer Night's Dream, let's say, 3 times. But for poetry, you are going to have to read it 3 or more times. Poetry tries to examine emotional states. Emotional states are not easy to articulate in language. Perhaps that's one of the major elements of poetry, that and the musicality associated with poetry, so that if you are a fan of music and musical lyrics, you'll know how oftentimes they can be quite poetic. And that said, the idea of evaluation of poetry is not necessarily an easy thing to do, as Dead Poets Society had talked about. You do want to annotate, as we've talked about all semester long, and read critically. Read the poetry out loud so that you can hear it. Listen for the sounds, because again, it's musical. And page 606 to 607 gives you some suggestions for approaching poetry. That's a page you might want to dog ear. The good news is that ultimately these suggestions are very similar to the suggestions that were given for approaching drama or for approaching short story. So, yes, you want to do multiple readings, and yes, you want to try to determine if there's a speaker and a setting, and there may or may not be with the poem. And yes, you want to consider the title and how the title might be significant. And yes, you want to consider things like symbolism and diction, the use of language. And yes, you want to consider multiple perspectives. There isn't one definitive interpretation. And yes, you might want to think about critical strategies, much like we talked about for reading short story and for reading drama. So how does biographical information about the author help you get a greater sense of understanding? Or how does the historical understanding of the time period help you understand the poem? When we start actually reading poems, I'm going to put them in chronological order so that you can see a kind of historical progression. And again, I kind of liken it to the progression that you might see with music. You can appreciate your favorite musical artists without knowing the musicians beforehand that influenced your favorite artist, but it's such a richer experience when you know the musicians that influenced your artist of choice, so that you can see the progression. And it's the same with poetry. Certainly we can't read poetry in its entirety. No class could ever offer that, and especially an introductory class, we're just going to get a little taste of some poems, especially because we've worked with poetry before in the drama unit. Shakespeare, of course, writes oftentimes in poetry and poetic structures, as does Sophocles in Oedipus the King, albeit we are reading a translation, so we might lose some of the elements of the poetry within the translation. And even something like A Raisin in the Sun is based on a poem, Harlem, A Dream Deferred. And talking about drama, as you know, this is where your second paper comes into play. And by this point, all of you should have received your first paper. So if you have not received your first paper back, please let me know. And you all have the option of rewriting paper number one. You just have to submit that in by the last day of class, though the sooner the better. You hand in the original with my commentary along with your revision. You can get the higher of the two grades. And basically, your second paper is very similar to what you did with your first paper. The distinction being that now you are writing about drama rather than short story. But it's the same length, and it's also a critical paper. And you can decide to write about Oedipus the King, or you could decide to write about A Midsummer Night's Dream, or you could decide to write about A Raisin in the Sun. And again, you can talk about whether or not a play should or should not be included in canon, or you could talk about whether a play does or does not have contemporary relevance, or you can create your own topic, but you just want to have that topic approved by me ahead of time. And in terms of the due dates for that paper, and the semester is quickly coming to a close, so I wanted you to be aware of that. Ideally, you would hand in that paper on May 1st, which would be Wednesday. I will take that paper up until May 8th. May 8th, believe it or not, happens to be our very last class of the semester. So, in terms of the 8th of May, that is the last day in which you could hand in paper 2 or any revisions as well. And our last class is devoted to the final examination. Now, if you're a returning student to GCC, you're probably aware that in the past we had an entire week devoted to the final exam period. Instead, what GCC has done is eliminated that week, made the classes a little bit longer so that our last class could be devoted to the final. And as you know, since paper number 2 is going to be due at the very ending of the semester on drama, that ultimately you won't have time for paper number 3 on poetry, which is why the bulk of the final 80 points will be devoted to poetry. And what I will be doing is selecting a handful of poems from the poetry section that we discuss and ask you to respond in brief essays. So that said, it's open book, open notes, so you can use whatever resources would be helpful to you. And I don't expect something as well written or well argued as what you would do, let's say, in a paper. But I still anticipate that you should be able to have an introduction and a body and a conclusion and be able to articulate some of the elements of the poetry that happen to be important. That's 80 points of the final, which leaves 10 points for short story and 10 points for drama, where again I will give you a series of short essay questions. Your responses will be even shorter than they would be for the poetry, because ultimately these are worth less points than the poetry. And there would be an opportunity for you to choose which piece you wanted to discuss, and also think about the fact that this is a film class as well as a literature class, so some of your options will include film, as well as some of your options will include text, and you get to choose from within that. So the best way really to prepare for the final is to have read everything and watched everything, all of the films, and of course all of the class videos, and also all of the class discussion form responses. So my intention is to catch up with the evaluation of all of the discussion form responses this weekend. So certainly you can use all of that information. And as you know, with the discussion form, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses. And all of that information will be useful for you for your final examination. So we'll talk a little bit more about the final when we get a little bit closer, but I just wanted to give you a sense as to where we are. And going back to the idea of poetry, and thinking about how one could view poetry, I suggest that what you do, and the text does as well, is that first you paraphrase it. You put it into your own words. And then ultimately, what you do is you try to explicate, which means to explain. This is where you give a detailed analysis of what the poetry means. And I gave you a sample poem to begin to practice this called Catch. And this is in the 5th section in the notes below. It's on page 596. But you can also see that I've given you a link for it. And it talks about how two boys, uncoached, are tossing a poem together, and overhand and underhand. And if you were to go through that particular poem and first you would paraphrase it, you'd see that what the poem is an extended metaphor. So what they're trying to do is to compare two dissimilar things with one another. How playing a game of catch is very similar to reading and writing poetry. You need two people to play a game of catch. And you need two people for poetry, one who is writing and one who is reading. And the repetition of the word hand, for instance, think about the importance of hands in a game of catch when you are throwing and catching a ball. Hands are also important when you're writing poetry. You need your hand to write. Or when you're reading poetry, because you should be taking notes. So in other words, you should be annotating the text. Even something as simple as boys at the very beginning of the poem. Think about when the poem was written, and it very much is a product of its time, where catch and also the idea of writing and reading poetry professionally was seen as a very male-dominated profession. So I don't think that it's any mistake that a poem written in 1950 says boys rather than girls or children, which would be both. The idea of youth, though, rather than people or adults, illustrates the idea that one need not be a particular age or have a particular level of experience to either play catch or to engage in poetry reading or poetry writing, which is why the word uncoached is used. Certainly a coach or a teacher can help one develop their skills, but that ultimately this is something that can be done naturally. And that the goal of the poem is to try to outwit, to make us have a workout, in effect, the way we would have a workout if we were tossing and catching a ball. It's the same kind of workout that we would have if we were reading and or trying to interpret and or writing poetry. Even the use of language such as cadence, which is about sounds, that the ball makes a sweet cadence down. The whistling, for instance, of the ball in the air. But of course, poetry is musical, as I was talking about earlier, so you want to listen to the orality of it. And that we have to scramble to pick up the meaning in this poem, much like we would have to scramble to pick up the ball if we were playing a game of catch. So, what you're doing is that you're going through the poem and you're trying to determine why the author made particular choices, and anything and everything counts. The shorter the poem, probably the more attention you need to pay to it. And things like punctuation become very important. Where a poet decides to end a line or begin a line. And this is nothing that is standardized. So that ultimately, when you're writing prose or complete sentences, you basically write from one margin to the ending of another margin on a piece of paper. That's not what happens with poetry. You write a staggered line. Perhaps that's the best way to differentiate poetry and verse, is that if you've got something with staggered lines, then it's poetry or verse, as opposed to a line that goes from one end to the other of the page over and over again, which is what we write in sentences. So perhaps visually the form of poetry is easier to identify than the actual definition of poetry itself. But that said, I think what you will find is that when you are reading and writing about poetry, you are going to be challenged. Much like you are challenged in a game of catch. You can do it for fun, but it is going to require some effort. You can even do it professionally. Most of us don't. You're usually born with a certain talent in order to be able to do it professionally. And an extended metaphor, the comparison of two dissimilar things, that's continued throughout the entire poem. So I thought this poem, Catch, was a good poem to sort of give us an overview of what we can expect when we are writing and also reading poetry. Now, in terms of evaluating the quality of something, we've been doing this all semester long when we've been talking about popular or formulaic writing as compared to what we've been calling literature, that which is worth academic study, that which would be included perhaps in the canon. And we talked about this with a Harlequin romance when we were in the fiction section, and then we compared that to something that would be also about a similar topic, which would be love, but was much more complex. So we compared and contrasted A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman. And then once again, we did something similar when we were talking about drama, and that the more common, perhaps, experience of consuming drama is through television. And we briefly read an element of a very popular television drama, Seinfeld, and we saw how the experience of reading is very different than actually seeing the drama performed in front of you. But also, more importantly, I think what we found is that while Seinfeld was a very clever show, it didn't have the level of depth or sophistication as Oedipus or Midsummer or Raisin. And that's to in no way denigrate Seinfeld, but it's written primarily for profit and entertainment. Yes, there's probably an instructional element to it as well, but it doesn't necessarily primarily focus on an instructional element in the way that the plays we read. And then in terms of evaluating poetry, again, I kind of think of Robin Williams and Dead Poets Society. And how do you go about evaluating poetry? And there isn't necessarily a formula with an access that you can use, but the text gives you two very different poems. One is called The Magic of Love, and the other is called Love Poem. And you can see that I've got the page numbers for those. I wasn't able to find Magic of Love in the online somewhere, but if you do, please let me know. But I was able to find Love Poem, and it's to illustrate the distinction between the two. That Magic of Love, I'll give you a gift from heaven above. It's the wonderful magic of love. Is very sing-song. It's very simplistic. It's very generalized. It's something that you might find on a greeting card. And not that there's anything wrong with a greeting card, but it's written to the largest denominator possible, to a general audience. So you should understand all of the vocabulary. You shouldn't have to necessarily struggle with understanding what the theme is. It should be applicable in a lot of situations. It's very cliche, it's very predictable, it's very saccharine. And it is very much hyperbole about the idea of love and its perfection. That's very different from the second poem we're given, called Love Poem. And it also is about love, but it's a poem that in some ways upsets expectations. You expect a poem of flattery when you're talking about love, and this poem goes back and forth between criticism of the person who's being discussed and then complimentary elements that this person is evidencing. And we assume that the person is female only because of one of the stanzas. Now, a stanza is a term that is used in poetry to indicate divisions that sometimes occur in poetry. It's much like a paragraph when you are writing an essay, in that a stanza can be visually seen as a division, and each stanza is supposed to be addressing a different topic, if you will. And this poem, Love Poem, goes back and forth. And it begins with my clumsiest dear. Now, dear is a term of affection. You would expect that in a love poem, but you wouldn't necessarily expect the person to be called clumsy. And told that even her hand shipwreck vases. And the idea of not just breaking vases, shipwrecking. So think about like catastrophe, and this is excessive about how incredibly uncoordinated this person is. except when it comes to relationship. This is where the person really shows their grace. And we go back and forth from stanzas that talk about how this person is always breaking things, the glasses chip and ring, to the idea that this person moves with ease with words and people in relationship. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Think about a refugee, somebody who is homeless and looking for home. Somebody who is so socially awkward and uncomfortable at your doorway, and you can invite them into your home and you can make them feel comfortable. Or the idea also of the drunk who's clamoring on his undulant floor, somebody who's had a little bit too much to drink in a social situation in your home, and yet you're able to find a way to get them gracefully home. This is very much a skill. The poem talks about how this person is the taxi driver's terror. Taxi drivers used to have a reputation of being horrifically bad drivers. So this person would have to be a terrible driver. And we're told how they shrink from far headlights, pale as a dime. They're too afraid to make a turn, even though there's plenty of room, that the next car is far, far away. And yet they leap before red apoplectic streetcars. So they basically go when it's unsafe, and an accident is just barely avoided. But then they move in a traffic of wit. And I love that term, traffic of wit, because we were just talking about driving. That's a kind of traffic. But language also is another kind of traffic. Driving is very similar to having relationship or conversation. It can be stop and go. Some people are better at it than others. You can get into an accident. You get the idea. And then we hear about how ultimately, the family is all devotion at her knees, even though her lipstick is on their coats. And one assumes that the time in which this particular poem was written, 1947, if there's going to be a reference to lipstick, then probably the subject of this poem is female. Not to say that either gender could wear lipstick, but especially in 1947, probably would have been a female. And that the coffee that's spilled, as well as the spilt bourbon, is a cause of celebration and joy, because that means this person is nearby. And for should your hands drop white and empty, if this person would die. And then my favorite line of the poem, all the toys of the world would break. And think about how sad that would be if there were no longer any toys in the world. Toys as a symbol of everything that's joyful and exciting and youthful. If nothing else, I think you can see the distinction between Magic of Love, which was pretty simple, and Love Poem, which is much more complex and is going to require multiple readings and is going to defy expectations. Now, if we were to go through a poem, we could evaluate a poem in terms of its structure, much like we could evaluate a sentence in terms of its structure. When you do that with a sentence, it's called diagramming a sentence, when you can determine what the noun is and the verb is and the preposition is. And you can do the same with a poem. You can go through a poem and determine if it has a rhyme scheme, which means a rhyme pattern. And you would look at the last word of each of the lines in order to determine if there is a pattern. You identify each rhyme with the letter of the alphabet. The first rhyme you identify with the first letter of the alphabet, A. And then when a new rhyme is introduced, you identify that with the second letter of the alphabet, which is a B. And you continue on, so forth and so on. And then you see if there's some sort of a pattern. And we had talked about this when we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman, that she was thinking about writing a sonnet, and she was thinking about ABBA, which is just the rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern, that the first and the fourth line would rhyme together and the two middle lines would rhyme together. And of course, she decides that her poem doesn't even have to rhyme. The idea that rhyming a sonnet in particular, as we will soon talk about when we talk about sonnets, has very strict rules. And she was initially contemplating writing a sonnet and following the rules, much like she's initially contemplating following the rules of being a wife and a mother. And then she realizes, maybe I don't have to follow the rules to write a sonnet. And maybe I don't have to follow the rules of what's expected for a wife and a mother. But we know that ultimately she's unable to do so by the ending. But In terms of identifying rhyme, you can also identify meter. You can determine the number of syllables that are in a line and whether or not there's a beat. So, for instance, in a Shakespearean sonnet, sort of like, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You hear ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Stressed and unstressed, it mimics a heartbeat, and that's been oftentimes said why Shakespeare's language is so appealing to the ear, because that was probably the first sound we all heard in our mother's womb, a heartbeat. Now, and the way that you would scan a poem for meter or for beat is by using slash marks to divide up all of the syllables, and then you would use accent marks to indicate which part of the word is stressed or unstressed. We don't usually use accent marks in English, but if you're familiar with some Romance languages, Spanish and French, for instance, they use accent marks. So you can see that I've assigned two poems, one entitled Waiting for the Storm, and this poem has been scanned for meter. So if you're reading it in the textbook, this is on page 760, you'll see that there are all of these marks on the poem, slash marks and accent marks, that don't appear in the original poem. So if you're looking at the poem online, and I was able to provide a link for that, then you can see that those don't appear. These would be added in after the fact if you were scanning it. And much the same with the second poem that I had assigned, Upon Julia's Clothes, that at the ending of each of the lines in italics are letters of the alphabet. And those would not have appeared in the original poem itself. Again, if you're looking at the poem online, you won't see those letters. Those were added in afterwards by somebody who was scanning. So I wanted you to know how to scan a poem, but the reality is if you can't connect what is happening with the structure of the poem to the poem itself, it probably is irrelevant. Much like you could diagram a sentence and determine all of its parts of speech. But my response is, so what? That it has 3 nouns and 2 verbs and 1 preposition. Now you would need to be able to show how and why that's relevant. So, for instance, you might say that the pronoun I is repeated 37 times in a text. My response is going to be, well, yeah, so what? And then if you wanted to make an argument that this text is about a very self-centered character, hence they always refer to themselves as I, then I could see how that argument would make sense. It would be the same with scanning a poem. So you can scan a poem like Waiting for the Storm, which is about a breeze that sends a wrinkling darkness across the bay. And what we have is the story of an individual who is at the water, the seashore, and sees and feels and hears a storm approaching, and they go underneath an upturned boat. And then the rain begins to fall. That's basically the action of the poem. But if you think about the way it would sound with its scan, something to the effect of present a wrinkling darkness across the bay I know. What it's mimicking are raindrops, and as the poem progresses, the beat gets faster as the raindrops would be faster. So the sound of the poem is trying to mimic the theme of the poem, which is rain. And if we were to do the same Upon Julia's Clothes, we get 2 stanzas. The first stanza, it all rhymes together in A's. The second stanza all rhymes together in B's. And this is about a person named Julia who's wearing silk clothing. And the author is talking about how beautiful Julia is, and it's much like liquefaction, the movement of her clothing, how smooth it is if you know anything about silk. And then the second part of the poem is not quite as obvious. And when you read the poem, you realize that the first part of the poem, Julia is in a state of dress. She's wearing silk. Silk is oftentimes worn actually for negligees. It doesn't necessarily have to be a negligee in this case. And the poet is commenting on the beauty of Julia in her clothing. The second stanza, the clothing has been removed. So now he's talking about the beauty of Julia nude, that brave vibration each way free. And I think that the different rhymes indicate the two stages of dress and undress. So that in this instance, the rhyme makes sense in terms of rhyme A, the first stanza, Julia wearing her silk, and the second stanza, rhyme B, where the brave vibration is free. She's free from her silks. She's nude. And then you can use your imagination about what happens after that. So I just wanted you to know how to scan a poem. I didn't necessarily expect you to scan poetry. If you do take a poetry class, however, you probably will spend some time scanning poetry. But the reality is that if you are going to scan any of the poems, then you want to do more than just illustrate how it works as a structure. You want to be able to talk about how and why that structure is important to the understanding of the poem itself. So I've basically combined two classes that I had in our syllabus. They were originally scheduled for April 8th and April 10th. So now basically I'm only one class behind because we've watched Dead Poets Society. We'll begin next class with the actual poetry proper itself with Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And also the Sick Rose. And notice that the Sick Rose is listed as a handout. So some of the poetry that I have listed on our course outline, some of those poems are not included in the edition of the text that I had ordered for us. So they are available as a separate handout, which I would be giving you in a face-to-face class. However, I am also providing you with links for those poems. So whenever it says handout, you can just rely on the link that I'm providing you for the poem. But I wanted you to know that if it says handout and you're using the text, you're not going to be able to find it in the text itself. And as the poetry continues, we will be able to actually listen to some of the poetry read by the either professional readers at some points, and then eventually read by the authors themselves as we get into more contemporary poems. So you can see that in the notes below in section 10, I have the links for all of those handout poems that we will be doing over the next several classes. So what's left is our attendance question, which would be due on Friday the 26th. Again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn, which will be coming this weekend. And then ultimately, that should help you in terms of being able to synthesize the class as a whole and be able to talk about its elements. So I wanted to go back to Dead Poets Society. As you know, I had asked you to try to define poetry in your own understanding, not a Webster's Dictionary definition. And because those don't really work, because there is no neat and tidy definition for poetry. And now that you've viewed Dead Poets Society in its entirety, and by this point you should have, name one major observation you had while viewing Dead Poets Society and why you feel that observation is important. Name one major observation you had while viewing Dead Poets Society and why you feel that observation is important. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with poetry. Take care. Bye-bye.